My ex told me she needed a break. That was 7 years ago. She never called. Last Saturday, she walked into my wedding reception, sat down at the head table, and told my wife she was sitting in her seat. My name's Adrian. I'm 34, and I need to tell you about the single most unhinged thing that has ever happened at a wedding reception in the history of weddings, receptions, and human behavior in general. And yes, I'm including that viral video of the best man who tripped into the cake. What happened at mine was worse. Way worse. Because at least that guy had the decency to look embarrassed. Before I get into the madness, let me give you some background, because without it you'll think I'm exaggerating. I promise you I am not. 7 years ago, I was 27 and dating a woman named Portia. We'd been together for just over 3 years, lived together in a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I genuinely thought she was my person. Not in a naive puppy love kind of way. I mean, I had looked at rings. I had a conversation with her dad. I was in deep. Portia was one of those people who could walk into any room and rearrange the social hierarchy in about 45 seconds. Gorgeous, sharp, funny when she wanted to be, and absolutely devastating when she didn't. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person on the planet when things were good, and like you were furniture when things weren't. I know that sounds like a red flag. It was. I just didn't own red flag glasses at the time. We had a good run for the first 2 years. Traveled together, cooked dinner most nights, had inside jokes that would make no sense to anyone else. I was working as a junior project coordinator at a mid-sized construction firm, pulling decent money, but nothing spectacular. She was doing marketing for a boutique agency downtown and talked about it like she was brokering peace treaties. But I loved her ambition. I thought we were building something. Then year 3 hit, and things started to shift. She got restless. Not in an obvious way at first. She'd make little comments about how we never did anything exciting anymore, how her friends were all traveling to Portugal and we were eating leftovers on a Tuesday. I'd suggest trips and she'd say we couldn't afford it, then buy a $300 jacket the next day. It was never about the money. It was about me not being enough of whatever she'd decided she needed that week. I tried. I really did. I planned a surprise weekend in Asheville. Booked a cabin, the whole thing. She spent most of it on her phone and told me on the drive home that the cabin smelled like old people. That was the moment I should have seen it clearly, but love makes you fluent in denial. One Thursday evening in October, I came home from work and she was sitting on the couch with that look. You know the one. The look that says a conversation is coming and you're not going to enjoy it. She had a glass of wine in her hand, which was already a red flag because she usually didn't drink on weekdays unless she needed liquid courage. She told me she needed a break, not a breakup. She clarified, like that distinction was supposed to make me feel better. She said she loved me, but she felt like she was losing herself, that she needed space to figure out who she was outside of us. She used the phrase, personal growth journey, without a shred of irony, and I sat there nodding like an idiot because I thought that's what a supportive partner does. I asked how long. She said she didn't know. I asked if there was someone else. She said no, and looked me dead in the eyes when she said it, which I later learned is a skill sociopaths and politicians share. I asked what I should do. She said just wait. So I waited. She moved out the next weekend. Took her clothes, her plants, her fancy espresso machine that I'd bought her for Christmas, and a decorative throw pillow that I swear was mine, but I wasn't about to fight over a pillow during what I thought was a temporary hiatus. The first month I texted her a few times. Casual stuff. How are you? Hope you're doing well. Saw this thing that reminded me of you. She responded to maybe half of them with one-word answers. Cool. Thanks. LOL. Real heartwarming stuff. By month 3, I stopped texting. By month 6, I'd accepted that the break was a breakup and she just didn't have the decency to use the right word. I never got a phone call. Never got a real explanation. She just evaporated from my life like she'd never been in it. And I was left standing in a half-empty apartment wondering what I did wrong. Here's the thing about being ghosted by someone you lived with for 3 years. It doesn't just hurt. It rewrites your brain. You start questioning everything. Was I boring? Was I not ambitious enough? Did I chew too loud? You replay every conversation looking for the moment you lost them, and you never find it because the truth is it was never about you. But you don't figure that out until way later, after you've already burned through a truly embarrassing amount of ice cream and sad playlists. I spent about a year in that fog. Working, going home, existing but not really living. My buddy Lawson basically dragged me back into the world. He's one of those guys who refuses to let you be miserable in peace. He'd show up at my apartment on a Friday night with a six-pack and say something like, "Get up, we're going to this thing." And the thing would be anything from a concert to a random trivia night at a bar I'd never heard of. Half the time, I didn't even want to go, but Lawson has this way of making no not an option. It was at one of those random outings, a friend of a friend's birthday party at a rooftop bar in South End, that I met Joelle. She was standing by the railing looking out over the skyline with a drink in her hand, and this expression on her face like she was working through a complicated math problem. I walked over because Lawson dared me to talk to someone new, and because she looked like the only other person at the party who wasn't trying to be the loudest voice in the room. I said something incredibly smooth like, "Nice view, right?" And she looked at me and said, "I've been trying to figure out if that blinking light is a plane or a star for the last 10 minutes, and honestly, it's ruining my night." I laughed so hard I almost spilled my drink, and that was it. That was the moment. Joelle was everything Portia wasn't, and I don't mean that as an insult to either of them. I mean Joelle was steady. She was kind in a way that wasn't performative. She was a pediatric occupational therapist who spent her days helping kids learn to tie their shoes and hold pencils, and she talked about her work with this quiet pride that made me feel like a better person just for listening. She laughed at my jokes even when they weren't good, and she called me out when I was being dumb, and she never once made me feel like I wasn't enough. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I took her to this little Italian restaurant we'd gone to on our first real date, got down on one knee between the breadbasket and the candle, and she said yes before I even finished the question. It was the happiest moment of my life up to that point. We planned a fall wedding. October, which I know is ironic given that October is apparently the month the universe likes to test me. The venue was this converted textile mill outside Charlotte with exposed brick and string lights and all that stuff that looks amazing on social media. Joelle handled most of the planning because she's terrifyingly organized, and I handled the things she told me to handle, which was mostly showing up where she pointed and nodding. Everything was perfect. The ceremony was beautiful. Joelle walked down the aisle and I cried, which I'd promised myself I wouldn't do and which Lawson has never let me forget. We said our vows, exchanged rings, kissed, the whole thing. Our families were there, our friends were there, and for about 3 hours I felt like the luckiest man alive. Then the reception started, and that's when everything went sideways. Because about 45 minutes into dinner, while I was mid-bite into the best piece of salmon I've ever tasted, the double doors at the back of the reception hall opened, and in walked Portia, 7 years later, in a white dress, like she'd been invited. I need to describe this moment carefully because I feel like some of you might think I'm being dramatic, and I need you to understand that I am being extremely literal. Portia walked into my wedding reception. She was wearing a white dress. Not off-white, not cream, not champagne. White. The kind of white that says I am either getting married today or I am fundamentally broken as a person. She had her hair done, full makeup, heels that clicked on the hardwood floor loud enough that people at the nearest tables turned to look. She walked with purpose, like she had somewhere to be. And apparently, that somewhere was the head table. Now, our head table was set up at the front of the room, long and rectangular, facing the guests. It was me, Joelle, my best man Lawson, Joelle's maid of honor Sutton, and both sets of parents. Standard stuff. Every seat had a place card. Every seat was occupied. Portia walked straight up to the head table, stopped directly behind Joelle's chair, and said, loud enough for at least 3 rows of tables to hear, "Excuse me, you're sitting in my seat." Joelle turned around. I turned around. Lawson turned around. My mother turned around so fast I thought she was going to pull something. For about 4 seconds, nobody spoke. It was the loudest silence I've ever experienced. Joelle, bless her, looked at Portia, then looked at me, then looked back at Portia and said, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" And Portia, without missing a beat, said, "I'm Adrian's girlfriend. We've been together since before you were in the picture. He knows what I'm talking about." Then she looked at me, and she smiled. I need to pause here and tell you what was going through my head, because it was a lot. First, confusion. Genuine, earth-tilting confusion, like when you walk into a room and forget why you're there. Except the room is your wedding, and the reason you're confused is that your ex-girlfriend from 7 years ago just materialized like a villain in a romantic comedy that nobody asked for. Second, anger. Deep, slow-building anger, the kind that starts in your chest and spreads outward. Third, and this is the one that caught me off guard, embarrassment. Because 160 people were watching, and I could feel every single pair of eyes on me. I stood up. I said, "Portia, what are you doing here?" She said, "I told you I needed time, Adrian. I've had my time. I'm ready now. 7 years." She vanished for 7 years. No call, no text, no message in a bottle, nothing. And she showed up at my wedding thinking we could just pick up where we left off. Like the intervening years were just a loading screen, and she'd finally pressed play. Joelle stood up next to me. She's not a confrontational person by nature. She's the kind of woman who apologizes to furniture when she bumps into it. But in that moment she was steel. She looked at Portia and said, very calmly, "I don't know what you think is happening right now, but this is our wedding. You need to leave." Portia's face did this thing where the smile stayed, but the eyes went cold. She said, "Sweetie, I've known Adrian longer than you have. I think he can speak for himself." That's when my mom got involved, which is a sentence that has never preceded anything calm or measured in the history of my family. My mother, Ruth Ann, is 5'2" and built like a retired point guard, and she does not suffer fools. She stood up, put her napkin on the table with the precision of someone holstering a weapon, and said, "Young lady, my son's wife asked you to leave. If you don't, I will personally walk you out, and I promise you it will not be the graceful exit you're imagining." Portia actually laughed. She laughed. Then she pulled out a chair from a nearby empty table, dragged it to the end of the head table, and sat down like she was joining us for brunch. She set her clutch on the table, crossed her legs, and said, "I'll wait. Adrian and I can talk after dinner." At this point the room was a mix of stunned silence and scattered murmuring. I could see Joelle's father halfway out of his chair like he was debating getting involved. Lawson had his hand on my shoulder, not to restrain me, but to ground me, because he could tell I was about 2 seconds from saying something I couldn't take back. I walked around the table to where Portia was sitting. I crouched down so I was at her eye level, and I spoke quietly, because whatever was about to come out of my mouth was between me and her, not the audience. I said, "Portia, you left me 7 years ago. You told me you needed a break, and then you disappeared. You didn't call. You didn't write. I waited for you for a year, and you never came back. I moved on. I fell in love with someone who actually shows up. We are married. As of 3 hours ago. You were not invited. You are not welcome, and if you don't leave right now, I will have you removed. Do you understand me?" She stared at me, and for the first time since she walked in, the mask cracked. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes got glassy. She said, "You were supposed to wait for me." I said I did. "You didn't come." She sat there for another 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then she stood up, grabbed her clutch, and walked toward the doors. But she stopped halfway and turned around, and she said something that I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "You're making a mistake, Adrian. She's not me." And Joelle, my incredible, unshakable wife, said from across the room, "That's the point." I heard at least 3 people gasp. I heard Lawson whisper, "Oh my God," under his breath. And I watched Portia's face go from defiant to devastated in about half a second before she turned and walked out the doors. The room was quiet for maybe 5 seconds after she left. Then my Uncle Hank, who has never read a room correctly in his life, raised his glass and said, "Well, I think we can all agree the chicken is outstanding." And the entire room burst out laughing, which honestly was exactly what we needed. The rest of the reception went on. We danced, we cut the cake, people gave toasts. But underneath all of it, there was this current, this electric undercurrent of what just happened, and I could feel it in every conversation, every glance. People were kind enough not to bring it up directly, but I caught the whispers. I saw the phones come out. I knew this was going to be the story people told about our wedding, and that made me furious. Not at the guests, at Portia, because she didn't just crash my wedding. She tried to hijack the best day of my life and turn it into her audition for a redemption arc that nobody was casting. Joelle and I didn't talk about it that night. We went to our hotel suite. We opened the champagne, and we sat on the bed and looked at each other, and she said, "So that happened?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I am now." And we left it there, because the night belonged to us, not to Portia's ghost. But here's what I didn't know yet. That wasn't the end of it. That was just the opening act. Because over the following weeks, Portia didn't just disappear back into whatever alternate dimension she'd been living in. She escalated. And the things I learned about what she'd been doing during those 7 years, and why she really showed up at my wedding, changed everything I thought I knew about our relationship and about her. I need to take you back to tell this properly. Back to those 7 years. Because what I found out rewrote the entire story. Let me rewind a bit. Because to understand why Portia showed up at my wedding like some kind of emotional arsonist, you need to understand what happened to me after she left, and more importantly, what happened to her. When Portia walked out of our apartment 7 years ago, I was a wreck. I won't sugarcoat it. I spent the first 3 months cycling between anger and bargaining. I'd wake up convinced I was over it, and by lunchtime I'd be composing texts I'd never sent. I lost 12 pounds because I forgot how to eat like a person. My boss at the construction firm, a guy named Clint who looked like a retired linebacker and had the emotional range of a calculator, actually pulled me aside one day and said, "Kid, whatever's going on, figure it out or take a week. You're making mistakes I wouldn't accept from an intern." Coming from Clint, that was basically a hug. I took the week. I went to my parents' house in Concord, sat on their back porch, and let my mom feed me casseroles while my dad pretended everything was normal by asking me to help him reorganize the garage. That's how my dad processes emotion, through alphabetized toolboxes. When I came back, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a movie montage kind of way. Just a small, quiet decision that I was done waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. I deleted Portia's number. I packed the last of her things that she'd left behind into a box, drove it to Goodwill, and donated all of it except one photo that I kept, because throwing away 3 years of memories felt like lying to myself about what it had been. I threw myself into work. And I mean threw. Clint noticed. He started giving me more responsibility, bigger projects, things that actually mattered. I went from coordinating schedules to managing small residential builds within a year. I got my PMP certification on nights and weekends, studying in my apartment with takeout containers stacked up like a skyline of poor decisions. By year 3 post-Portia, I was a senior project manager handling commercial builds, and Clint was telling anyone who'd listened that I was the best hire he'd ever made, which was the closest thing to an Academy Award speech the man was capable of. The money got better. The confidence came back. I bought a condo. Nothing fancy, but it was mine, and there's something about owning a place that makes you feel like you've told the universe you're planning to stick around. And then there was Joelle. I already told you how we met, but what I didn't tell you is how she rebuilt parts of me I didn't even know were broken. She didn't do it with grand gestures. She did it by being consistent. She called when she said she'd call. She showed up when she said she'd show up. She didn't keep score, didn't play games, didn't make me guess where I stood. After Portia, that kind of reliability felt revolutionary. Like discovering that not every stove burns you. Joelle and I moved in together after about 1.5 years. We got a place in Plaza Midwood with a little backyard that she immediately filled with raised garden beds. She grew tomatoes and basil and something called lemon balm that she put in everything. I built her a potting bench one weekend, and she acted like I'd handed her the keys to a castle. That's Joelle, grateful for things that matter, unbothered by things that don't. Now, while I was out here building a life, Portia was doing something very different. I didn't know any of this at the time, mind you. Most of it came out after the wedding, when the full picture started assembling itself like the worst jigsaw puzzle of all time. But let me lay it out for you now because it's important. When Portia left me, she didn't go on a personal growth journey. She went to Miami with a guy named Garrison. Garrison was apparently a real estate developer who drove a car that cost more than my annual salary and had the personality of a LinkedIn post. They'd been talking for about 2 months before she asked me for the break, which means the break was never a break. It was an exit ramp she'd already merged onto. Portia and Garrison lasted about 1.5 years. From what I pieced together through mutual friends and some light social media reconnaissance that I'm not proud of, the relationship was volatile. Garrison liked to spend money, and he liked Portia to look a certain way and act a certain way. And Portia initially loved the lifestyle, but eventually hated the leash that came with it. They split. She moved back to Charlotte, and that's where the trail goes cold for a while. Over the next few years, Portia bounced between jobs, relationships, and apartments. She lost her marketing position, worked retail for a while, tried to start a social media consulting business that never got off the ground. I heard bits and pieces from Lawson, who still had a few mutual connections, but I made a conscious effort not to dig. She was my past, and I wanted her to stay there. What I didn't know And what I only found out after the wedding fiasco was that Portia had been keeping tabs on me the entire time. Not in a casual, checking in kind of way. In a dedicated, tracking my life kind of way. She followed Joel's social media. She knew when we got engaged. She knew when we set the date. She knew the venue. And according to someone who eventually told me the full story, she'd been telling people for months that she was going to get me back. That Joel was a placeholder. That Adrian was her person and always had been. And that when the time was right, she'd make her move. The time she chose was my wedding reception. Let that sink in. She watched me build a new life for 7 years, said nothing, did nothing, and then decided that the appropriate moment to re-enter the picture was while I was legally and emotionally committed to someone else. That's not love. That's not even obsession in the romantic way people try to glamorize it. That's entitlement. Pure, undiluted entitlement. The belief that someone will always be yours regardless of what you do or don't do, regardless of time, regardless of their choices. But I didn't know all of that yet. In the days after the wedding, what I knew was that Portia had shown up, caused a scene, and left. What I felt was a weird mix of anger, pity, and relief. Anger because she tried to ruin the best day of my life. Pity because she was clearly in a bad place to think that was acceptable. And relief because Joel had handled it with more grace than Portia deserved and more strength than I probably would have shown. Joel and I went on our honeymoon. We spent 10 days in Costa Rica, zip-lining through cloud forests and eating ceviche on the beach and pretending the rest of the world didn't exist. It was exactly what we needed. We talked about the wedding incident once, briefly, on the third night. Joelle said she felt sad for Portia, which honestly made me love her even more. Then she said, "But if she ever comes near our life again, I'm not going to be sad. I'm going to be a problem." And she said it with a smile that was somehow both warm and terrifying. We came home. We unpacked. We started our married life. And for about 3 weeks, everything was normal. Then the messages started. The first message came through Instagram. A DM from an account I didn't recognize. No profile picture, barely any posts. It said, "Adrian, we need to talk. Please. I know I messed up. Just give me 5 minutes. You owe me that. I owe her that. 3 years of dating, 7 years of silence, a white dress at my wedding, and she thinks I owe her something." I didn't respond. I blocked the account. The next day, a new account messaged me. Same tone, slightly longer. She talked about how she'd made mistakes, how she'd been scared, how Garrison had been controlling, and she'd been too embarrassed to come back after that. She said she'd been in therapy. She said she understood now. She said she just wanted to explain. I blocked that one too. Then she found my work email. My professional, corporate, this goes through the company server work email. She sent a message with the subject line, "Personal matter," and a 2-paragraph letter that read like a cover letter for a relationship position she was no longer qualified for. She talked about our connection and our history and how she knew I still felt something because she could see it in my eyes at the wedding. I hadn't looked at her with anything but disbelief and exhaustion. So either she needs glasses or she was projecting on a scale that would impress an IMAX theater. I forwarded the email to my personal account for documentation purposes and deleted it from my work inbox. I told Joelle about all of it. I showed her every message. Because here's a lesson I learned the hard way from watching other people's relationships implode. Secrets are termites. They eat the structure from the inside, and by the time you notice, the whole thing is ready to collapse. Joelle and I weren't going to have secrets. Not about this. Not about anything. Joelle read everything calmly. Then she said, "This isn't just someone who wants to talk. This is a pattern. You need to send one clear message telling her to stop, and if she doesn't, we go to a lawyer." So I did. I unblocked the first Instagram account and sent one message. "Portia, do not contact me again. Do not contact my wife. Do not show up at my home or workplace. This is the only response you will ever receive. If you continue, I will pursue legal action. I wish you well, but we are done." She read it within minutes. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared. Then she replied, "You're going to regret this." I screenshotted everything and saved it. For about 2 weeks, nothing happened. I started to think that was the end of it. Portia had made her play, been rejected, and retreated. I could live with that. I could even feel sorry for her from a comfortable distance. Then Lawson called me on a Tuesday night and said, "Brother, you need to check Joelle's clinic's Google reviews. Right now." I pulled it up on my phone. There, sitting at the top of the recent reviews, was a one-star review from a name I didn't recognize, but with language I did. It talked about how the clinic was unprofessional and run by someone with questionable judgment and morals. It didn't name Joelle specifically, but the implication was clear to anyone who knew the context. And it wasn't alone. There were two more, posted within hours of each other, from different accounts, all with the same vague, pointed language. Joelle's clinic was a small private practice. She and her business partner, a woman named Delaney, had built it from nothing over 4 years. They worked with kids, families, people who trusted them with their children. Fake reviews weren't just annoying. They were potentially devastating. Joelle didn't panic. She got quiet, which is somehow scarier. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and said, "Okay, we're documenting everything. And then we're talking to someone." The someone was a lawyer named Fletcher Graves. I am not making that name up. The man's name was Fletcher Graves. He wore suspenders unironically, and he looked like he'd been litigating since before the internet existed. Lawson knew him through his brother-in-law, and he specialized in harassment and protective orders. We sat in Fletcher's office the following Thursday and laid everything out. The wedding crash, the messages, the work email, the threat, the fake reviews. Fletcher listened to all of it without interrupting, which takes a level of patience I don't possess. And then he leaned back in his chair and said, "This is textbook harassment, and it's escalating. We have two options. We can send a cease and desist, which is a formal legal warning, or we can go straight for a restraining order. Given the pattern, I'd recommend both." We went with both. Fletcher drafted the cease and desist that afternoon and had it served to Portia's last known address by the end of the week. Simultaneously, we filed for a restraining order, attaching every screenshot, every email, every fake review, and a written timeline of events going back to the wedding. Joelle also reported the fake reviews to Google with documentation. 2 of the 3 were removed within a week. The third took longer, but eventually came down too. Delaney, who was now fully in the loop, was furious on Joelle's behalf and offered to testify if needed, which is the kind of business partner loyalty you can't buy. While all of this was happening, something else came to light that I honestly wasn't expecting. Lawson, who has a network of connections that I'm convinced rivals the CIA, found out through a mutual acquaintance named Cordell that Portia's life had been falling apart for longer than I'd realized. She'd been fired from her last job after a conflict with a co-worker that escalated badly. She'd been evicted from her apartment. She was living with her sister Waverly, who by all accounts was tired of enabling her but didn't know how to stop. And she'd been telling people, multiple people, that Adrian was the one who got away and that getting me back was the thing that was going to fix her life. I want to be clear about something. I didn't feel good hearing this. I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied. I felt sick. Because I'm not a prop in someone's salvation story. Nobody is. And the idea that someone could spend 7 years not fixing their own life because they'd convinced themselves that fixing it required getting someone else back is genuinely heartbreaking. But heartbreaking doesn't mean I had to set myself on fire to keep her warm. I'd done that once. Never again. The restraining order hearing was scheduled. Portia was served. And according to Fletcher, she hired a lawyer, which meant she was planning to fight it. Good, I thought. Let her fight it. Because I had the receipts, I had the timeline, and I had a wife who was standing next to me like a fortress with a garden out back. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning in the county courthouse. Joelle took the day off. Lawson insisted on coming for moral support, even though he had no legal reason to be there. My mom wanted to come too, but I told her it was better if she stayed home because the last thing I needed was Ruth Than going viral in a courtroom. We arrived early. Fletcher was already there, organized and calm in a way that made me feel like we were in good hands. Portia arrived 10 minutes later with her attorney, a younger guy in a suit that was slightly too big for him, carrying a folder that looked thin. She didn't look at me when she walked in. She sat down on the opposite side of the room and stared straight ahead. And that's when I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was just ready. Ready for this to be over. Ready for Portia to finally understand that whatever story she'd been telling herself for 7 years, the ending she wanted wasn't available. The book was closed, and I was the one who'd written the last chapter. The hearing lasted about 45 minutes, which in courthouse time is practically a speed run. Fletcher presented our case methodically. He walked the judge through the timeline starting with the wedding crash, laid out the escalation from social media messages to the work email to the explicit threat, and then presented the fake reviews targeting Joelle's clinic. He had printouts of everything, organized in a binder with tabs, because Fletcher Graves is the kind of man who brings a binder with tabs to a legal proceeding and makes it look intimidating. The judge, a woman named Holbrook who looked like she'd heard every excuse ever invented and was tired of all of them, listened carefully. She asked clarifying questions. She reviewed the screenshots. When Fletcher got to the part about the fake reviews targeting a pediatric occupational therapy clinic, she paused and looked at Portia for the first time with an expression that could only be described as professionally unimpressed. Then it was Portia's attorney's turn. And look, I'm not going to be cruel about this. The guy tried. He argued that Portia had been going through a difficult period, that the messages were attempts at reconciliation, not harassment, and that the wedding attendance was misguided but not malicious. He used the phrase romantic in nature to describe Portia's behavior, which made Joelle exhale through her nose in a way that sounded like a pressure cooker releasing steam. Judge Holbrook asked Portia directly if she had anything to say. Portia stood up. And I'll give her this, she was composed. She spoke clearly, and she didn't cry. She said she'd loved me for 10 years. She said the break was the biggest mistake of her life. She said she never meant to hurt anyone, and that she just wanted a chance to explain herself. The judge listened. Then she said something I'll remember forever. She said, "Ma'am, wanting to be heard does not entitle you to an audience. Mr. Calloway asked you not to contact him. You continued. You targeted his wife's place of business. You sent a message that a reasonable person would interpret as a threat. The right to move on is not conditional on the other person agreeing to hear your explanation. The restraining order is granted." Portia's composure cracked. Not dramatically. Her shoulders dropped about an inch, and she blinked rapidly, and she sat back down without another word. Her attorney whispered something to her. She nodded, and that was it. The restraining order was for 2 years. No contact with me, no contact with Joelle, no coming within 300 feet of our home, my workplace, or Joelle's clinic. Violation would result in arrest. Fletcher told us after the hearing that in his experience, the order itself usually ends the behavior because once it's a legal matter with real consequences, the fantasy collapses. We walked out of the courthouse into bright October sunlight. Joelle slid her hand into mine and squeezed. Lawson, who'd been sitting in the gallery like a silent bodyguard, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Drinks tonight. Non-negotiable." Fletcher shook our hands and told us to call if anything else came up, then walked off looking like a man who'd won 1,000 of these and planned to win 1,000 more. I thought the story ended there, but there's an epilogue, and I think you need to hear it. About 3 months after the hearing, I got a letter, actual physical mail, which felt almost quaint. It wasn't from Portia. It was from Waverly, her sister. The letter was handwritten, 2 pages, and it was one of the most honest things I've ever read. Waverly wrote that she was sorry for what Portia had done. She said she'd watched Portia spiral for years and hadn't known how to help. She said the restraining order had been a wake-up call, not just for Portia but for the whole family, because they'd been enabling her by treating her fixation on me as romantic instead of recognizing it for what it was. Someone who couldn't face the consequences of her own choices and needed a fantasy to survive. Waverly said Portia was in intensive therapy. Real therapy, not the Instagram quote version. She was living in a structured program and working on accountability in a way she never had before. Waverly wasn't asking me to forgive Portia or to respond. She just wanted me to know that the situation had been taken seriously and that Portia was getting help. I showed the letter to Joelle. She read it twice. Then she said, "That took courage to write." And she was right. Waverly didn't owe us anything, and sending that letter was an act of integrity that I respected deeply. I didn't write back, not because I was angry, but because I think some doors need to stay closed for everyone's healing. I wished Portia well silently, in my own head, in my own time, and I moved on. That was over a year ago. Here's where things are now. Joelle and I just celebrated our first anniversary. We went back to that Italian restaurant where I proposed, sat at the same table, and she ordered the same dish she'd ordered on our first date because she's sentimental in a way that makes my chest tight in the best possible way. We're talking about buying a house. Something with a bigger yard for her garden beds and maybe, eventually, for kids. She wants 2. I want whatever she wants. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but it's not. It's the truth. I'd build a life around whatever makes her happy because she'd do the same for me. And that's what a partnership looks like when both people actually show up. Work is going great. Clint semi-retired last year and handed me a portfolio of projects that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. I'm managing a mixed-use development downtown that's the biggest project of my career, and every morning I drive to that site and think about the kid who couldn't get out of bed after his girlfriend left without saying goodbye. That kid wouldn't recognize me now, and I think he'd be proud. Lawson is still Lawson. He's dating a woman named Ramona who is somehow even more socially aggressive than he is. And together they are an unstoppable force of dinner invitations and unsolicited life advice. They're coming to Costa Rica with us next month for a trip that Joelle planned. And I already know Lawson is going to try to convince me to go skydiving because the man has never met an adrenaline rush he didn't want to personally befriend. My parents are thriving. My dad finally finished organizing the garage and has moved on to the attic, which my mom says will take him until the heat death of the universe. Ruthann has become Joelle's biggest fan, which is both heartwarming and slightly terrifying because my mother's loyalty is absolute, and she's already told me, in front of Joelle, that if we ever split up, she's keeping Joelle. I believe her. As for Portia, I don't know the details and I don't seek them out. I hope she's doing better. I genuinely do. Not because I owe her that, but because carrying resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to get sick, and I've got too much good in my life to waste energy on bitterness. Here's what I'll leave you with. 7 years ago, a woman told me she needed a break and never came back. For a long time, I thought that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. Turns out it was the best. Because if Portia had come back after 6 months, or a year, or even 2 years, I would have taken her back. I know that. And I never would have walked into that rooftop bar. I never would have talked to the woman staring at a blinking light in the sky. I never would have found the person who makes me feel like I'm enough exactly as I am. Portia once told me, she's not me. She was right. Joelle isn't her. Joelle is better. Not because she's more beautiful or more accomplished or more anything measurable. She's better because she chose me and she keeps choosing me. Every single day, without conditions, without breaks, without disappearing. That's the whole story. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I'm going to go home now, kiss my wife, water her lemon balm, and be grateful for the life I almost didn't get. Take care of yourselves, and remember, someone leaving you isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's a gift you don't know how to unwrap yet.